So guys, welcome back. I have yet another product review. Today we're going to look at the Sony Alpha 6300. It's a 4K mirrorless camera. And basically what I'm going to do, you can use the navigation at any point in this video to jump to the different parts. First, I'm going to do an unboxing. Second, I'm going to do some test shots with this Sony Alpha 6300, and I'm going to show you some full HD footage as well as 4K footage. So let's get rolling with the unboxing. Let's get started. So guys, and now like promised, the unboxing of the Sony Alpha 6300 APS-C size camera with 24 megapixels. And yeah guys, when this cam came out on the market, it was about a $1,000 price point. Since then the prices have dropped a little bit, so you're gonna probably be able to snap them off for a little bit cheaper. And one thing I know from experience with these Sony cams is that they have this XAVC S codec, as you can see here. And while that can give you a much nicer quality, it also tends to produce much larger files. So that's the only downside that I think with the Sonys is if you use the XAVC S codec, is the increased file size, which for me, since I rarely shoot 4K with my Canon EOS, right now I'm filming with the Canon EOS M3 with an old Canon EOS M3. That is one thing to consider because it's more demanding on your storage capacities when you do a lot of video editing. So if you have an old computer and a clogged up hard disk drive, you may want to also consider upgrading your hard disk drive with a bigger solid state disk drive or something like that to be able to handle all the big video files that this cam is able to produce for you. But guys, before I digress any further, let's look inside the box. Obviously, this camera has been used for a little bit, so now I can share with you the experiences that I got so far. Also, one nice thing I noticed about the Sony, which I'm going to show you in a second, is these plenty available accessories. So right off the bat, comparing the Canon EOS M against the Sony Alpha 6300, I think the Sony is kind of like a little bit of the winner when it comes to accessories. Because let's look here, like if you unfold this, there's like a tremendous amount that apparently you can choose from. And with the Canon EOS M3 system, I always felt there are significantly less choices available. And yeah guys, if we look in the chart, the Alpha 6300 is APS-C size, and probably will have to look for the E-mount if you want to get another lens. But having said that, for like the average casual user, I usually get very good results with the stock lenses, both with the Canon and the Sony. So my recommendation is just try the stock lens for a while and see if you're happy with it. I'm usually, at least with my YouTube videos, I'm always working with the stock lens and I have no problem at all. For example, creating like nice blurry background effects such as this. You can see the camera is really in focus and the background is nice and blurry. So I think what we're going to do is that in part 3, I'm going to go outside and show you some test footage. Like I previously said, you can always use the navigation at the bottom below. And then we also gonna do some examples with blurry background, because the kit lens of the Sony is a little bit different than on my Canon. So I'm thinking just, hey, why not compare this? As well as the difference shooting in 4K and 1080p. Because my Canon right now is only 1080p. Accessory-wise, the Sony Alpha 6300 comes with this USB charging adapter and a USB cable, and then the power plug, one's for overseas and one for Germany. So that is what you can expect to find inside the box. And yeah guys, like I said, the only downside that I can see with having a 4K camera is really that it produces significantly larger files. And also when editing 4K video footage on your computer, you have to simply realize that editing 4K footage is way more demanding on your computer when handling, exporting the video files, rendering them. So if you're planning to use a camera like this primarily for video, please make sure that your computer is able to handle A, a lot of data volume, and B, the 4K resolution. In my case, up to now, I always have worked with an old iMac, and the iMac was able to handle 1080p just fine, but 4K footage is a little bit more challenging. Other than that, I really love this cam. Maybe I can turn it on for you here and show you the menu. And basically there are two things I want to point out about the Sony right away. One thing I really love about the Sony that unfortunately my Canon does not have is, you see, like I talk, I'm quiet, and I talk again, these volume meters. I think this is so super useful. I so much wish my Canon would have that, because I'm using these small mirrorless cameras for video all the time, and the one thing that I'm missing is to be able to monitor the audio levels all the time, because video needs audio, that goes hand in hand. So that's a big plus point, a big thumbs up for the Sony. Volume level. On the flip side, this is not a touch panel, so I can touch this and nothing happens. So I always have to go into the menu and then move around. Whoops. I always have to go into the menu and move around and change the settings in the menu. I cannot just touch on something. That's a benefit of the Canon EOS M3. My old Canon EOS M3 has a touch capable display, so personally I feel using a touch display is kind of nicer. Build quality wise, I hope this shows that Sony has a really nice build quality. Feels very nice. And here at the side, this is also something when you want to take a mirrorless DSLR for video, make sure it has a separate microphone input. In the case of the Alpha 6000, you can see this here. There's like this flap, you open it, and here you can connect an external lavalier microphone or something like this. Personally, I love to use lavalier mics because they're going to give a great sound, but I'm going to show this to you in a second when I go outside. So what else to talk about? I told you about 4K versus 1080p. I told you that 4K is more demanding. I told you that Canon doesn't have this XAVC codec that produces a higher bitrate, while the Sony has the XAVC codec. I told you the Sony has no touch display, the Canon has a touch display. The Canon, when I bought the Canon, was about $500 to $600. So the Sony is a little bit more pricey, but that is to be expected since the Sony supports 4K. And also, I remember Sony's, from all I can see, seem to have a faster autofocus. So if autofocus is really relevant for you and 4K is relevant to you, you're probably gonna have a better time with the Sony. Only thing that I like more with the Canons is, I think, the color profile. I mean, right now you see the colors of the table, and maybe if I have something here, the orange, or even in this brochure. I mean, just go to my YouTube channel and watch a few other videos, and up to now I shot everything with the Canon, and I really love the color profiles that are in the Canon. So that's also something you may want to pay a little bit of attention to, because as far as I can see, the colors come out slightly different with the Sony. And I have seen some videographers and photographers buying Sonys and then try to change some of the color profiles to match with the Canons. So the Canon might have a subjectively nicer color profile, but like I said, it's subjectively. So before I digress any further, that's the unboxing. I talked a little bit about the Sony Alpha 6300. So why don't we go outside and shoot some test footage, both in 1080p and full HD and in various codecs. So let's get rolling, jump to part 3, and let's watch some test footage, guys. Let's go outside. So guys, I switched positions a little bit. Now you're seeing the footage of the Sony Alpha 6300. As you can see here, my old trusty Canon I have here. And maybe you already noticed a slight difference in the color profile. It's up to you to judge. So essentially the footage that you're seeing is still full HD, it's full HD footage. I'm going to switch to 4K in just a second, but the important part, I'm not using the XAVC codec right now. I'm just using the MP4 setting. So you basically, it's somewhat of the lowest setting that I would usually pick when having this 4K Sony. The benefit of MP4 and Full HD is that you have a smaller file size. And obviously when you edit the video, it's gonna be less demanding on your computer. So honestly, you could almost buy this 4K Sony and still use it like the old Canon. So, but by the way, let's jump to some 4K footage. And I'm just gonna go over there and show you some 4K footage in the XAVC codec. So let's get rolling.
And to access the original 4K footage in the full 4K resolution, you can use the link in the navigation below.
So guys, now you are seeing some test footage in 4K, and maybe I can also zoom in a little bit for you guys here. I find the zoom button and do one of these buttery smooth motions. And yeah, maybe you can see the colors. There's some reds and greens over here. And basically overall, I think 4K is really exciting if you have the fast computer and the editing and storage capabilities, because one of the key benefits of recording in 4K footage obviously is the higher resolution. And let's say like in this example, I'm recording in 4K, and then when I'm exporting the video file, obviously the compression feature is running over the 4K footage and it just has more data. So even if you're watching this in full HD right now, because that's the way I'm exporting it, it should still look sharper and more crisper than the footage of the Canon EOS M3. So guys, and one last thing we may want to check is the autofocus ability of the Sony, because that was always one big plus with the Sonys. They're apparently like really blazing fast autofocus speeds. And for this, I'm just gonna walk a little bit closer and see how the Sony performs. And then I'm gonna walk it back a little bit just to give you like an impression of how the autofocus works. And we can also flash this filter, this Hoya filter in front of the lens. And there you can see up there in the background with the tree, the really nice blurry effect. So the filter is super sharp and the background is blurry. I always love this kind of effect. And taking the filter away, you see it gets sharp again. So I really like the autofocus, and I really like the kit lens. The kit lens has really a nice performance. So that really goes to show that you don't necessarily have to buy an additional lens if you want to, for example, use this kind of camera for creating YouTube videos like I'm doing right now, or product reviews. So guys, this concludes the review of the Sony Alpha 6300 mirrorless camera. And we're just gonna jump to the summary and conclusion part. And in the conclusion part, maybe we just jump into the computer. I show you what the file size and data rate of these different files that we created are, and run over some additional specs, and that will conclude the video. So I see you in the next part.
So guys, welcome to the conclusion part of the Sony Alpha 6300 review. And the first thing I would like to point out is, for example, when we look, I imported the footage that I just recorded and I just showed you in the computer. And you see there are different files in here, and the big ones labeled with the C are basically the 4K footage. And then this is the MP4 footage. And then I even have some footage of my Canon. And if we quickly look at the 4K footage, and I open this with QuickTime, here you can see the imported file. Let me resize this a little bit. The important part we want to pay attention to is the data rate. I shot the 4K footage at 25 frames per second, and I set the 4K data rate to the 60 mbit second. To the 60 mbits per second setting, simply because if you use the Sony and you shoot in 4K, basically you have to use the XAVC codec, and there it offers you two settings, the 60 mbit or the 100 mbit. And probably the most new users would think like, oh yeah, I want the biggest and best data rate. But let me tell you, even at the lower setting of 60 mbits per second, the test footage file that I have is about 2 minutes and 30 seconds long, and already it has created a gigabyte file. So just doing a quick estimate, we can already guess if you record 10 minutes of footage in 4K with the Sony on the 60 mbits setting, yeah guys, I would guess 10 minutes of video would produce at least 4 gigabytes of data. Now just imagine for a second, if you put it really on the max setting, you will probably have 10 minutes of video in 4K, and the Sony will probably create more closer to 8 gigabytes per 10 minutes. So that's literally what I mean. If you shoot in 4K on the full settings, be prepared to handle a lot of data. I mean, your system needs to be able to handle a lot of data. So now the second thing I want to point out, I intentionally on purpose tested the Sony in HD with the lower setting to see what the performance and the visual quality would be. And if we quickly open the file again, you probably have already seen that when you shoot HD and you use the MP4 setting, the quality of the Sony sort of lags. Obviously, that's just my opinion, so don't like quote me on that. And I think there would be a way around that. And unfortunately, I kind of missed to test that. My thinking is, if you can probably use the Sony for full HD as well, but when you shoot full HD with the Sony, don't put it in the MP4 settings. While it will produce a very small file size, I think the Sony really works the best if you use the XAVC codec. I really feel sort of the Sony is made for these other codecs and not for the standard MP4. And again, MP4 is just I believe the encapsulation, and the real codec is the H.264. So if you use a Sony, yes, it can produce MP4 files, but my recommendation is don't use this codec with the Sony, because as you can see here, I go and show in the inspector, you see it's an MP4 file that the Sony creates. Basically, when you pick the MP4 setting in the Sony, it will use the H.264 codec, produce small files, but the crispness and the quality, I feel gets kind of lost. For comparison, I have the footage from my Canon right here, and if we look at the Canon, I feel like the Canon does a way better job at using the H.264 codec. You see everything looks really nice and crisp. Obviously, you kind of can screw up with the Canon as well. It's not all about the codec, it's not all about the camera, it's also a fair amount is also how you use it, if you're knowledgeable about lighting and picking the right settings and stuff. But overall, my feeling is, if you still have an older computer and you don't want to make this 4K switch yet, a Canon EOS M3 or M6, something like that, will still work very, very nicely. Having said that, as soon as you start using the Sony with the XAVC codec, the Sony will outperform the Canon. At least that's my impression from testing both these cameras. I feel the Sony has a faster autofocus, and if you switch it to XAVC Full HD or you switch it to XAVC in 4K, it will just create such a much crisper image. And yeah, I like the color profile of the Canon a little bit more, but hey, if you don't like the color profile the way it is, you can always tweak it a little bit in your video editing software, and the color profile of the Sony is okay too. So honestly, I really have to say
that if you have a fast computer with an up-to-date graphics card and lots of storage, it's really worth making the switch to 4K, simply because it will make your videos more future-proof. This is the only downside that I can think of with my Canon EOS M3, that when I create full HD footage and I watch that full HD footage on these 4K displays that start to appear everywhere, that, let's just face it, full HD footage is nice and full HD footage looks very nice on a full HD display, but everybody who has already made the switch to using a 4K display on their computer, for example, if they watch videos on YouTube that are shot in full HD, it just doesn't look as nice. So that's why 4K is probably the way things are going to go. And yeah guys, to wrap this up, I've shown you the benefits of using the Sony versus my old Canon, and I walked you through all the little details. Faster autofocus of the Sony, bigger file size of the Sony, more accessories apparently available for the Sony, and so on and so forth. So this really now concludes this product review. I see you as a subscriber on my channel and in one of my other videos that I have. All the best to you, take care.
And since you watched the video of the Sony Alpha 6300, you may also be interested in the review of my Canon EOS M, which I've been using for quite some time, because switching to 4K might not be for everybody yet, simply because you need such a powerful computer. But in any case, I see you as a subscriber on my channel and maybe even in one of my online courses. All the best to you, take care.